the United States Senate focus its efforts on how do we cooperatively grow this industry. It means more union auto workers going to work. It means more non-union auto supply chain workers going to work. But all of these are good paid jobs, and that's what do we care about more here than preparing an environment for good paying jobs that put people back to work and can help them join the middle class. Madam President, I yield the floor and suggest the absence of the floor.
The clerk will call the roll. Mr. Akaka.
Madam President.
The senator from Texas.
Madam President, I rise to talk about a bill that we have, I understand we're in a quorum call, and I ask that it be lifted.
Without objection.
I rise to talk about a bill that was introduced this morning, but I'm told that it doesn't have a bill number yet. But the bill is the Strengthening and Enhancing Cybersecurity Using Research, Education, and Technology Act, which we refer to as the Secure IT Act. Madam President, this is a very important piece of legislation because we know that cybersecurity is a threat to our country, and we need to strengthen our laws to assure that we are protecting our assets, our communication systems, and all of the infrastructure that is run through communications systems. We are working as a group. Senators McCain, Chambliss, Grassley, Murkowski, Coates, Burr, and Johnson are original co-sponsors. Many of us are the ranking members on the relevant committees that must deal with cybersecurity. Senator McCain, the lead sponsor, is, of course, the Armed Services ranking member. I am the ranking member of Commerce. Senator Chambliss of Intelligence. Senator Grassley, certainly of Judiciary, and Senator Murkowski of Energy. It is very important that our relevant committees have come together with our ranking members, and we hope very much to gain support from the Democratic side as well, on a bill that we think can get through all of Congress and be signed by the President, because the parts of our bill that will strengthen our cybersecurity in this country are, I think, accepted in the areas where we already have expertise in this area. For instance, our bill will help prevent the spread of cyber attacks from network to network and across the Internet by removing barriers to sharing information about threats, attacks, and strategies for improvement of defenses. We remove these barriers through addressing the antitrust laws that would allow companies that are sharing information not to be threatened with antitrust suits, because this is a security issue. It's not a competitive issue. Secondly, we want to have liability protections for those who disclose cyber threat information with their peers. These are things that would be in everyone's interest for us to do, and we do need to address it in legislation. The liability and antitrust protections are available to all companies that would share information, not just those that share with the government, but where they can talk to each other, understanding each other's systems. Further, the Secure IT Act would require that federal contractors providing electronic communication or cybersecurity services to federal agencies share cyber threat information related to those contracts. Of course, when they have contracts with the government, those are going to be very important communications systems that would require the sharing of information about threats that might jeopardize the system's security. In addition, the government will develop procedures for the timely sharing of classified, declassified, and unclassified information to ensure that information needed to secure networks is fully accessible to trusted parties. We are concerned that there are other bills out there that will add another new bureaucracy, another layer of regulation that is not necessary, and brings in another agency that would overlay the security agencies that already have systems in place. It would also allow the regulatory bodies for certain areas of interest to handle the cybersecurity rather than another overlay of a new department. I think, Madam President, that so many people in our country who are in business feel that they are just overwhelmed with duplicative regulations and different agencies that they have to report to. We want to streamline who they have to report to and try to use existing structures and existing regulatory authorities to deal with each individual company or industry so that we don't have to give them yet another new bureaucracy that would then have regulations if they are deemed to be critical infrastructure. That's when it becomes the regulatory threat. We believe that the private sector is more aware of individual security needs, better equipped than the Department of Homeland Security to secure its own networks, working with its own regulators. According to the Office of Management and Budget, the government itself has had great difficulty in preventing attacks on federal systems. So we do require that the reporting of federal contractors go to the federal security agencies, but we don't think the federal agencies being in charge of everything is necessarily an improvement. We want to make sure that the Federal Information Security Management Act, which is the law, is actually updated so that the new forms of cyber threats are accommodated in this FISMA, Federal Information Security Management Act, and to strengthen that with the updates. The legislation also updates the criminal code to address cyber crimes, strengthening penalties, improving the Department of Justice's ability to prosecute this kind of criminal that would take down whole systems of our government. And our bill will prioritize cybersecurity research and development so we can harness innovation to protect our country and our private industries from cyber attacks. So I am very pleased that we've been able to introduce this legislation as an alternative to some of negotiating. Perhaps we could come to an accommodation with the bills that have been introduced with other sponsors. But we don't think that the bills that have been introduced address our concerns that would assure that we don't have another big federal bureaucracy, that we don't overlay the regulators that already have expertise in this area with new regulators that we have to train and deal with. We think the Defense Agency, the National Security Agencies, the Defense Intelligence Agency, the CIA, all of these, and with their cyber security assets already in place, are the better place to put the strength, not reinventing the wheel, but better utilizing the systems that we already have. Madam President, I think that it is time for our Senate to address cybersecurity. I think we have good proposals out there. Perhaps we can take the best of all of those proposals, but I think this is the right approach, and Senator McCain, Senator Chambliss, Senator Grassley, and Senator Murkowski were key to drafting this piece of legislation that I think will get the support of all of the stakeholders as well as the House of Representatives to actually pass a bill to improve our systems and take it to the President for signature. Thank you, Madam President, and I yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll. Mr. Akaka.
So, general speeches on the floor of the Senate. The Senate has defeated a Republican effort to roll back President Obama's policy on contraception insurance coverage. The amendment is to the transportation bill and was defeated 51 to 48. It would have allowed employers and insurers to opt out of portions of the president's health care law that they found morally objectionable. That would have included the law's requirement that insurers cover the cost of birth control. Republicans said it was a matter of freedom of religion. Democrats said it was an assault on women's rights and could be used to cancel virtually any part of the law. So general speeches for about another hour or so in the Senate as negotiations continue on the transportation bill. The House has finished up legislative business after debate and three largely non-controversial bills that happened earlier today. The House will not be in session tomorrow. They'll return on Monday at noon Eastern. Legislative business will get underway at 2 p.m. And among the bills next week, two measures Republicans say will spur job growth. You can see the House live on C-SPAN.
suspended and that I be recognized as if in morning business.
Without objection.
And, Madam President, I also ask that morning business be extended for an additional 10 minutes and that I be allowed to engage in colloquy with the senator from South Carolina.
Without objection.
Madam President, Senator Graham and Senator Hoeven and Senator Blumenthal and Senator Sessions and I had a very interesting trip last week where we visited various countries and learned a lot at each one. But the reason why we are here on the floor today is to talk a bit about the recent release, thank God, of Americans who were in the American embassy and were subject to trial and prosecution by the Egyptian government. It was a humanitarian issue from the standpoint that no American citizen should be treated that way, especially by an ally, but it was also a larger issue in that the outcome could have significant impact on relations between our country and Israel and Egypt. And Egypt, as my friend from South Carolina well knows, is the heart and soul of the Arab world. What happens in Egypt affects the entire Arab world, and our relationship with Egypt is one that is vital, not just for Egypt, but our national security interests are that the region remain peaceful and that there not be a conflict and abrogation of the treaty that was concluded between Egypt and Israel as a result of the Camp David agreements. I think it's important to recognize that Egypt is in a bit of a turmoil. I think it's important to recognize, Madam President, I asked unanimous consent that Senator Hoeven be added to the unanimous consent for a colloquy.
Without objection.
So these young people were from National Democratic Institute and the International Republican Institute and Freedom House, unfortunately had to go to our embassy because they were going to be prosecuted under then Egyptian law. And I'd like to begin by saying that our ambassador to Egypt, Ann Patterson, may be one of the finest diplomats that this nation has produced. The more the senator from South Carolina and I travel, and the more representatives at the U.S. embassies that we meet and have discussions and travel with, these people are enormously good, and we are proud that they represent the United States, particularly Ann Patterson. She has worked tirelessly since this whole crisis began, and I believe that the majority of the credit for what this successful outcome as far as our American citizens are concerned can be directly attributed to her dedication, her hard work, her tireless efforts day and night on behalf of these young people. So we're extremely proud of her. I'd like to ask my friend from South Carolina what he thinks was the reasons why the Egyptian government changed what they had previously said would be a judicial prosecution of these American citizens to allowing them to leave Egypt and return to the United States as they are on their way.
Well, one, I'd like to add my gratitude to and recognition of Ambassador Patterson and her whole team, the whole State Department team on the ground. They did a very good job making the case to the Egyptian government. But we have to, I think, all realize that Egypt is in transition. They've just had their elections for the lower house, the parliament. The upper house has not been seated yet, and they haven't elected a president. They've gone from a dictatorship to emerging democracy. And this case comes along, the NGO prosecutions, I think both of us, all of our delegation, this is just offensive. The IRI, NDI are Republican, Democratic organizations funded by the government and the private sector that try to help emerging democracies all over the world. They've been in every country, hotspot you can name, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, doing great work, and the accusations were that the people involved in these organizations, Senator McCain is the head of IRI, were involved in spying and espionage. So I just want to take the floor and say I find the accusation offensive and without merit. And the Egyptian co-workers, Egyptian citizens who were working with IRI and NDI are still in custody in Egypt, facing criminal prosecutions for helping these fine organizations, and we will not take our eye off of that, and we will, keep pushing to make sure we get the right answer. But how did this end? We know how it started. I think it was a political effort to talk about, try to justify a Mubarak-era law that was used to oppress and keep out of the country people who were helping to bring about change. And one of the bright spots of this engagement was that the Army, General Tantawi, was as helpful as he could be, given the constraints of the Army in this new government formation. But when we engaged the Muslim Brotherhood, the Freedom and Justice Party, the largest bloc in Parliament, Senator McCain, in his first engagement, the first thing he said to the representative was this NGO situation, how damaging it was to Egypt-American relationships, how unfair it was, how out of bounds it was in terms of the law. And the response was from this group that we find the NGO law unacceptable, unjust, and we're wanting to change it. And once that statement was made publicly, it allowed this momentum to withdraw or lift the administrative travel ban. The cases may still go forward, but our people are coming home. So I think the reason this happened is because of the collaboration between the State Department, the delegation, every aspect of the American government, and the people on the ground in Egypt, I think, understood the value of the U.S.-Egyptian relationship, and the judicial system finally made a wise decision. But to those left behind, we're certainly standing with you, and you will not be forgotten. So this could have ended the U.S. Senator McCain, let me ask you a question, Senator Hoeven both. If this had not been resolved well, if they had insisted on prosecuting and having the American Citizens Question appear in cages before an Egyptian court based on an outlandish accusation, what kind of reaction would we have had in the United States, and what damage would it have done to the U.S.-Egyptian relationship, in your opinion?
Well, as the senator from South Carolina knows, there was a pending amendment to cut off the $1.3 billion, and I'd emphasize to my colleagues that $1.3 billion was a commitment that was made at the time of the Camp David Agreement, which led to a peace agreement between Egypt and Israel, which is, if that amendment had been enacted, I am confident would have then caused the Egyptians to abrogate the peace treaty with Israel, and the consequences of all that I'm not sure of. I would like to emphasize to my friend, and I see Senator Hoeven here, we did have meetings with the Speaker of their Parliament and his colleagues. We did have meetings with the chairman of their Committee on Human Rights, who happens to be the nephew of Anwar Sadat, one of the signatories to the Camp David Agreement, the signatory, along with Menachem Begin. We did meet with the Muslim Brotherhood, who then agreed with us that NGOs are important and the law needed to be revised. And, of course, we met with Marshal Tantawi, the head of the interim military government. And what confused us a bit at first, I'd asked my colleague from North Dakota, was that everybody said, we're with you, and yet they were gridlocked. In the words of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff who had been over there earlier, they were paralyzed. And it seemed to me that the statement of the Muslim Brotherhood, who all of us, I know, have concerns about, but it was a statement of the Muslim Brotherhood supporting NGOs, supporting revision of the Mubarak law that seemed to be a major factor in unsticking what had clearly been a situation which day by day grew more and more of a crisis. And I'd ask my friend from North Dakota if he got that same impression.
Well, I'd like to thank the esteemed senator from Arizona for allowing me to join him on the floor today to talk about this very important issue that has had a favorable outcome. Even more importantly, I want to express my great appreciation and gratitude to Senator McCain and Senator Graham for really organizing the opportunity for us to go over to Egypt and to not only meet with our NGO workers at the U.S. Embassy, but to engage in conversations and meetings with military and government leaders on this very important issue. And it's not just the 7 Americans who we're very concerned about in their safety, which obviously is paramount, but as Senator Graham indicated, this situation clearly had ramifications for the relationship on a longer-term basis between Egypt and the United States and Egypt and Israel, particularly in regard to the peace treaty. So taking this initiative to sit down with General Tantawi, Marshal Tantawi, Field Marshal Tantawi, who is the leader of the Military Council, but also the leaders of the Freedom and Justice Party, which is really the majority party now in the Parliament. And, of course, that is the Muslim Brotherhood, and we sat down with Muslim Brotherhood as well. I think those meetings were extremely important in helping to foster an understanding that broke the logjam. I, too, want to commend the work of our ambassador, Ambassador Ann Patterson. She did an outstanding job. I want to thank Secretary Clinton and the people at the State Department for their diligent efforts. But I must say, having the opportunity to be part of a delegation led by Senator McCain and Senator Graham gave us the opportunity to talk to the Muslim Brotherhood, gave us the opportunity to talk to the leaders of the Freedom and Justice Party. And the next day they put out a statement which I agree was very important in helping move things forward, because what they said in that statement were two things that I do think helped break the logjam. First, that they support non-government organizations. They support non-government organizations. They recognize that these NGOs do important work, and they want to address the laws in Egypt to make sure that they have good laws that will enable the NGOs to continue. The second thing they said in there, which I felt was particularly important, is they also expressed their concern about NGO workers and that those NGO workers be treated fairly. And for me, as Senator McCain said, I hail from the state of North Dakota, and he knows I'm going to say this. I can see the smile sneaking up on his face already. One of these NGO workers, one of the Americans detained under the travel ban, who I had opportunity to visit with at the embassy, is a woman named Stacy Hogg. And she's been over there working, and needless to say, I was worried about all of our Americans. I was really worried about Stacy and making sure that she and her fellow workers, and of course Secretary LaHood, son Sam LaHood, but all of them, that they were able to get home safely. And so, you know, I think it was important in terms of fostering an understanding that I hope now will continue as we work to build relations with Egypt and their new government. I will. To the senator from South Carolina.
I'll turn it back over to Senator McCain. I can tell you that very few people in Egypt were, almost no one in Egypt did not realize somebody from North Dakota was being held. You are on message. You are very effective, and I hope Stacy and her family appreciates it. I know they do. But for everybody, Sam, the NDI workers, the whole gang, we're proud of what you do. And I just want to, Senator Blumenthal's here, and I just want to let people know this was a bipartisan delegation. And we had a kind of a dinner meeting when things were not going so well. and about the idea of bringing our American citizens down to Egyptian court to be put at risk security-wise and maybe to be put behind cages, which would have destroyed the relationship. I think Senator Blumenthal made it crystal clear that's not a good idea, and thank God it didn't happen. So with that, I'll yield back to Senator McCain.
I agree with my colleague from South Carolina, Senator Blumenthal was very important, one, for bipartisanship, but his background as a prosecutor. At one point in all this back and forth, one of the lawyers, will be unnamed, had said to Senator Blumenthal that, well, we probably have to go along with the advice of the lawyers, and Senator Blumenthal, in a very succinct way, said, well, maybe it's time to fire the lawyers. So I want to thank Senator Blumenthal for his involvement and the expertise and knowledge that he brought to this whole scenario because of his background as a prosecutor and attorney general of his state. And so I guess I wonder from my friend from Connecticut if he believes that this kind of thing is something that we should really be emphasizing these NGOs, and so that maybe we can prevent this in the future. For example, when we visited Tunisia, the Tunisians have enacted a law that encourages the participation of these dedicated men and women who come and live and work in their country and help them build democracy. That was what was so, not enraging, but certainly was so frustrating, was to hear these people who are only trying to build democracy. They weren't there to make money. They weren't contractors. They weren't anybody that was in business. They were just trying to help them build democracy, and they end up in the situation they were in, which caused us from time to time to maybe grit our teeth, I would ask my friend from Connecticut.
Thank you to my colleague from Arizona who led this trip and very enthusiastically and emphatically, I would say the answer is yes, we should be encouraging these non-governmental organizations that are committed to the cause of democracy and human rights and civil society. And their work in Egypt and in places like Tunisia and other areas of the Middle East, as well as around the globe where democracy and freedom are at risk and sometimes at grave peril, has been enormously important. And I was so proud and grateful to be part of this trip led by Senator McCain and to really hear and see the kind of respect that there is in the world for his views, for his leadership, as well as for Senator Graham's, and the receptiveness is probably an understatement that Field Marshal Tantawi, leaders of Parliament, others in Egypt had for his statements about the importance of allowing these Americans, these 7 Americans who committed no crime, to leave that country. And the power of his and Senator Graham's statements, the ability of our colleagues, such as Senator Hoeven and Senator Sessions, to speak not on behalf of the United States, because we were not there to negotiate, but really on behalf of public opinion in the United States, I think was very instrumental and shows the importance of the interchanges and the relationships that can be built when we interact face-to-face on the ground with our peers and contemporaries in foreign countries. Not that we were speaking as military people or as diplomats, but simply in reflecting the opinion of people in the United States that these Americans, innocent of any crime, should be permitted to leave the country. And
it's striking that these new parliamentarians, they were most eager to have interparliamentary association with us. They wanted to come to the United States to have further relations between the 2 elected bodies. I was very impressed by that.
And I would say, yes, indeed, I was extraordinarily impressed by their eagerness to see what democracy looks like as it really works. Remember, some of these individuals have been in prison for long periods of time, some of them under the most brutal conditions, many of them tortured while they were there, with little exposure to the real world of democracy. I think, in answer to the senator from Arizona's question, would be very helpful to them. And, in fact, on a number of occasions, we invited them to come to this country. But I would ask the senator from Arizona and perhaps my other colleagues who are on the floor today to look ahead and to comment perhaps on what we can do to move in a positive way from here, because I think that all of us feel Egypt is really a linchpin for our relationship to that area of the world going forward. So much that's exciting is happening in that part of the world, and Egypt is so critical to it. So I would ask my friends from Arizona and South Carolina and North Dakota what they feel perhaps are positive steps that we can take to build on this good step forward.
Very briefly, before I turn to my other two colleagues, the day we arrived in Egypt, there was a suppliers conference, companies and corporations from all over the world, ranging from companies like General Electric, Boeing, the major corporations. And it's very clear, the one thing that they need is jobs, jobs and jobs and jobs. Unless their economy improves, their tourism has collapsed. Unless their tourism is their economy improves, I think they're going to face some very significant challenges. So at least I was very happy to see a lot of American participation in that gathering. I think they said there was like 600 people in that room, all of them representing various businesses in the United States. That really is, and of course they are experiencing a hard currency crunch right now that's very significant. Senator.
Well, I think it's a very good topic to be talking about, the future, because this was an episode that could have destroyed the relationship before it had a chance to mature. But what am I concerned about? I am still concerned about the development in Egypt. The Constitution will be written here in the coming months, by the summer. I want to make sure that America's voice is heard about who we are. We hope the Egyptian people embrace tolerance, that Coptic Christians are going to be welcomed, as they've been for centuries in Egypt, that religious minorities will be protected, that women will not be taken back into the darkness, that the Constitution will reflect as Islamic nation that understands the concepts of tolerance and free enterprise. So the Muslim Brotherhood will be the leading organization politically. It is up to them to create an environment where the world feels welcome. It's up to them to create an economy working with their coalition partners. So we'll be watching, and it's not what you say in politics, it's what you do. Apply that to all of us here, and I think we're failing our people back in the United States by talking way too much and doing too little. But the summer, between now and the summer, can really be outcome determinative for decades in Egypt. So I'm urging the Egyptian political leadership, the Muslim Brotherhood included, write a constitution and create an environment where people feel like they can come to visit Egypt and do business. And Senator McCain's dead on. There's a lot of money to be made interacting with the Egyptian people. They're a proud people, they're smart people, and I want to get our businesses on the ground. I want to help the Egyptian economy develop through the private sector, not just the public sector. I'm the ranking member of the Foreign Operations Committee working with Senator Lee, the chairman. We will be continuing to provide economic assistance, but the end game is to create a functioning society that we can do business with, where we can create jobs in America. The main thing to do in the short term is maintain the military relationship. The reason Egypt did not become Syria when you had people rising up against the autocratic regime is because the army stood by the people. And the relationship we've had with the Egyptian military for over 30 years really paid dividends. Egyptian officers coming to American military academies and schools have been invaluable. So as we go forward, maintain that relationship between us and the Egyptian army, honor the treaty with Israel, make sure you write a constitution worthy of a bright future in Egypt. And to all the political leaders in Egypt, the world is watching, the Arab world is watching, And if you have a narrow agenda, if you have an exclusive agenda, then you will be doing your country a disservice. So we will be a willing partner, but not under any and all circumstances. Maybe we've learned our lesson, that you just can't have partnerships without basic principles. And so we look forward to working with the Egyptian parliament and people, but you have a chance to change the course of history in the Arab world and the Mideast. Don't lose the opportunity.
I would echo the sentiments of good senator from South Carolina. And I guess what I'd like to add, and I think that's exactly the right question to pose. The senator from Connecticut says, where do we go from here? And I think that's right on. There's no question in my mind that the relationships that Senator McCain and Senator Graham have built overseas make a difference for the United States and our foreign policy. And this is a clear example of it. When we sat down with Field Marshal Tantawi, when we met with the other government leaders, even when we met with the Muslim Brotherhood, the fact that there was a relationship there, that they knew these individuals, there was some level of trust there that enabled us to engage in very important communication that produced a message that I think was integral to resolution of this situation, which could have been a very bad one. So these relationships matter when we talk about working with other countries, particularly in that part of the world when there are so many differences between our countries and how we operate. Having some relationships where people can sit down, have these discussions, and talk about how we work together and foster some mutual agreement and some mutual understanding is vitally important. At the meeting with the Freedom and Justice Party parliamentary members, we invited them to come visit us. And I think that would be very helpful and very important, not just so these new leaders in their parliament have a better sense of the United States and how we work and the kind of relationships that we can foster in both business and government, but so that the members of this Senate, of this Congress, and our people here get a better sense of them as well. I think that is very important as we track forward with this new young government that is now embarking on writing a constitution and governing in a vitally important country in the Middle East. And I, at this point, would like to